Some people come into your life like weather, sudden, and changing everything. Willa Oakes was 24 years old when she arrived in Harlan County, Nebraska, in the spring of 1887, carrying a carpetbag, a wooden crate of books, and an opinion about nearly everything she had not yet been asked. She had taken the job as schoolteacher at the Greeley Crossing Schoolhouse because it was available, because it paid $30 a month, and because her aunt in Omaha had suggested, with the particular gentleness of someone who has run out of patience, that a young woman with Willa's disposition might benefit from some open air and distance from city life. Willa had not disagreed. She had disagreed with nearly everything her aunt had said that winter, which was probably the aunt's point. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of a shallow creek at the bottom of a long, sloping field. To the north of it was a timber claim that belonged to a man named Everett Colm. To the south was the road into town. To the east was the creek, cold and clear and running fast in April. And right up against the western wall of the schoolhouse, close enough that on windy days the branches scraped the whitewashed boards like something knocking to come in, was the apple orchard belonging to Everett Colm. Willa did not meet Everett Colm right away. What she met first was his ladder. It was leaning against the western wall of the schoolhouse on her second morning, left there without explanation, and when she went outside to investigate, she found a pair of work boots on the ground, and, above her, a man of approximately 52 years of age, halfway up a branch that had grown directly over the schoolhouse roof, sawing at it with the focused expression of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. "Good morning," Willa said. The sawing paused. The man looked down. Everett Colm was 53 years old, though he looked like a man who had been 53 for a long time and intended to remain so indefinitely. He had a broad, weathered face, gray at the temples, and the kind of hands that suggested he had been using them hard since before Willa was born. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he did not account for in his planning. "Morning," he said. "Is there a reason your ladder is against my schoolhouse?" "Branch," he said, and returned to sawing. Willa stood there for a moment, arms crossed, head tilted. "I can see the branch. What I am asking is why you didn't knock. Didn't want to interrupt class. Class doesn't start for another hour." He paused again. "Didn't want to interrupt your morning, then. You've interrupted it considerably by being on my wall." He looked down at her again. His expression was not unkind. It was, she would think later, the expression of a man who found the world mostly reasonable and was mildly unsurprised to encounter something that wasn't. "The branch was going to come down on your roof," he said. "Next hard rain." Willa looked up. The branch was thick and heavy and hanging at an angle that, now that she studied it, did look like trouble. "All right," she said. "But you could have said, you're saying now, because I found you on my wall." He had the good grace to acknowledge this with a slight tilt of his head. The sawing resumed. Willa went inside to make coffee, and when she came back out with 2 cups, the branch was on the ground, and the ladder was being folded up by a man who looked faintly surprised to be handed a coffee cup, but accepted it without comment. His name, she learned, was Everett Colm. He had farmed the timber claim for 21 years, had come out from Ohio at 32 with a younger brother, who had since moved on to Oregon, and had stayed because, as he put it, "The soil was good and I didn't want to pack again." He drank his coffee, standing up, and handed her back the cup with a nod that she would later understand was his version of a great many things. "Thank you. Good morning. You're not entirely what I expected. I'll be going now." She watched him walk back through the orchard with his ladder over one shoulder and thought that he was the quietest man she had ever encountered and probably the most certain of himself, and these two things seemed to be related. The apple trees were the problem, or rather the apples were. In September, which was Willa's first autumn in Harlan County, the orchard dropped its fruit with the cheerful disregard of something that does not know it is inconvenient. Apples crossed the property line in the way that gravity tends to respect no one's boundaries. They rolled under the fence and across the yard and lodged themselves in the corners of the school steps, where the children tripped on them and the smaller ones sat down and simply began eating them as though this were a planned part of the curriculum. Willa wrote a note. She was aware that a note was perhaps formal for a neighbor, but Everett Colm did not appear at predictable intervals, and she had things to say that she felt deserved to be said without standing in a yard waiting for him. Mr. Colm, the windfall apples have become a hazard near the schoolhouse steps. I would be grateful if you could collect them at week's end, or let me know if you'd prefer I have one of the older boys bring them back to your property. Yours respectfully, W. Oakes, Greeley Crossing School. She left the note folded on his fence post, which was the only communication surface available to her, and waited. His reply appeared the following morning, same fence post. Miss Oakes, I'll come Saturday. The apples are good eating if the children want them. I don't mind if they take what they like. E. Willa read this 3 times, unsure whether she was being generous-spirited or managed. She wrote back, Mr. Colm, the children are already eating them. My concern is the ones they don't eat, which are becoming soft and attracting insects. I'll let the children know they're welcome to take them home. W. Oakes he came Saturday, as promised, with a large flat basket and the same purposeful efficiency he seemed to apply to all things. He collected the windfall apples in under an hour, stacked the basket beside his fence, and was nearly gone before Willa, who had been watching from the schoolhouse window with the fixed attention of someone pretending not to watch, came outside. You cleared all of them, she said. That was the arrangement. You could have left some. The children do like them. He considered her. I thought you wanted them removed. I wanted the soft ones removed. The firm ones are perfectly good. There was a pause. He set down the basket. Miss Oakes, he said, your note said the apples were a hazard. The windfall apples were a hazard. The firm ones that came down recently are fine. Another pause. His expression did not change exactly, but something in it shifted. A slight adjustment, the way a man recalibrates a measurement he was certain about. I see, he said, and then, I'll leave the firm one Saturday next. Thank you, said Willa. He picked up the basket and walked back toward his fence. She was almost back inside when she heard him quietly, as though he were speaking mostly to himself. You might have said that in the note. She stopped. She turned around. He was not looking at her. He was opening his fence gate, basket in hand, with the perfectly calm air of a man who has said a reasonable thing and expected no contradiction. I might have, Willa said, very deliberately, if the distinction had occurred to me as necessary. He latched the gate. Wind doesn't sort apples, Miss Oakes. He went home. Willa stood in the schoolyard for a long moment after he'd gone, aware of the very specific feeling of having said something reasonable and still, somehow, lost the argument. Now, if you'll let me step out of the story for just a moment, I want to ask, where are you listening from today? Are you in a farmhouse with the window cracked, somewhere in the Midwest? Sitting in your car in a driveway in the South, waiting just a few more minutes before you go inside? Maybe you're in another country entirely, and this old Nebraska landscape is just a picture in your mind. Wherever you are, I'd love to know. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from, and if this story is finding you at the right moment. And if you're enjoying it, a like means more than you know. It keeps stories like this one coming. All right, back to the apple orchard. Back to Willa and Everett. They're not done yet, not by a long way. The notes continued through October. Willa was not sure when they stopped being about apples. There was the note about the fence post that was leaning into the school property line, a concern for the children's safety as they do run. There was his reply, I'll fix it next week. Is Wednesday convenient? Or will that disturb afternoon lessons? There was her reply to his reply, Wednesday, after 3 is fine. The children leave at 2:30. There was his note about the creek running higher than usual and the footbridge being uncertain, which he had observed while checking his irrigation and thought she should know, since she crossed it every morning. She read that one twice. He had noticed she crossed the bridge every morning. She wrote back, "Thank you for the warning." "I crossed at the rocks." W.O. his reply. "The rocks are slippery when the creek is high. I can put in a temporary plank if it would help." E.C. her reply. "That seems like considerable trouble." W.O. his reply. "It isn't." E.C. She found the plank the following morning, solid and well placed, with a piece of rope strung between two stakes on either side as a handhold. Willa stood there for a moment, looking at the plank and the handhold, and thought that she was not sure she had ever met a man who was so matter-of-fact about the act of making someone's life easier. There was no performance to it. He did not wait to be thanked. He built the thing and went back to his work. She crossed the plank and went to school and taught fractions to 9 children of varying enthusiasm, and did not think about Everett Colm for nearly 45 minutes. In November, he invited her to see the orchard. It was not framed as an invitation, exactly. He mentioned, in a note, that he was pressing cider on Saturday and that the press was loud and might disturb her if she had work to do in the schoolhouse, but that she was welcome to come see the operation if she was curious, since some teachers liked to bring students for agricultural observation, and he didn't mind either way. Willa read this note 4 times, identified the invitation buried under approximately 6 layers of practical information, and wrote back, "I'll come Saturday. What time should I arrive?" W.O. his reply, 10 o'clock. Bring a cup if you have one. E.C. She arrived at 10 with a tin cup and found Everett Colm, 53 years old and entirely in his element, up to his elbows in apple pulp, explaining to his farmhand, a young man named Abner, who could not have been more than 18, and seemed to find everything faintly amusing. The precise pressure needed for the first pressing. He looked up when she came through the gate, and there was that expression again. Not unwelcoming, not quite warm, but something that had started to feel, to Willa, like its own particular kind of welcome. "Miss Oakes," he said. "Mr. Colm." She looked around at the orchard, the press, the barrels, the towers of apple crates. "This is more than I expected." "Most things are more than people expect," he said, and returned to the press. She spent 3 hours there. She asked questions about the varieties of apple, about the timing of the harvest, about whether cider was more profitable than selling the fruit directly, about the soil composition of his claim compared to the county average, which she had read about in the agricultural report she'd found in the schoolhouse cupboard left by a previous teacher with apparently eclectic interests. Everett Colm answered every question, not in the way of a man performing knowledge, but in the flat, certain way of someone who has simply spent 21 years learning one piece of land until he knew it the way you know your own hand. Around noon, Abner went to get lunch from the house, and they were alone in the orchard, and Willa was sitting on an upturned crate with her tin cup of fresh-pressed cider, and Everett Colm was wiping his hands on a cloth and not quite looking at her, and then he said, without preamble, "How old are you?" "Miss Oakes?" 24, she said. "You?" He looked up. The question had surprised him. 53, he said. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Halverson told me when I first arrived. She told me everyone's ages. It's how she organizes the county." Something happened in his face. It was brief, and it was almost a smile. "She told me yours too," he said. 24, and that you'd come from Omaha and had opinions." "She's not wrong," Willa said. "No," he said. "She's not." And then neither of them said anything for a moment, and the press dripped, and somewhere in the upper branches a bird moved, and Willa thought, 29 years between us. She thought it the way you think something you've been not thinking for a while, the moment when you admit to yourself that you've been aware of it all along. "Is that a problem?" she asked. He looked at her. "Is what a problem?" 29 years, she said. There was a long pause. He folded the cloth and set it on the edge of the press. "I don't know what you're asking, Miss Oakes," he said. But he said it slowly, and he did not move away. "I think you do," she said. "I think you're a man who generally knows what people are asking." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It might be a problem for you," he said. "It isn't one for me." Willa drank her cider. "Then, we're in agreement on at least that." Abner returned with lunch before either of them said anything else, and they ate with him and talked about the price of apples in winter. And Willa left at 2 o'clock and walked home over the plank bridge, and did not trip on anything because the rope handhold was exactly the right height. She stayed through the winter. There had been some question of this. Her friend Josephine Marsh had written from Lincoln, suggesting that Greeley Crossing sounded lonely and far, and wasn't there a school nearer to the city, and wouldn't Willa like to come home for the spring term? Willa wrote back that she was quite content where she was, that the school had 16 students now and was growing, and that she had developed an interest in agricultural methods that she was finding surprisingly absorbing. Josephine, who knew Willa well, wrote back, "Are the agricultural methods tall and broad-shouldered by any chance?" Willa did not reply to that particular letter for 2 weeks. Through December and January, the notes slowed. Not because they stopped, but because winter quieted everything. The children's attendance dropped in the worst weeks, the creek froze solid and rendered the bridge question irrelevant, and the orchard stood gray and bare and gave no occasion for discussion. But on the first Friday of each month, without quite being scheduled, they both seemed to arrive at the fence line at the same time. Willa would bring coffee in a covered pot. Everett would have something, a problem to think through, a question about one of her students whose family he knew, once a book he thought she might find interesting, a history of Nebraska settlement that turned out to be exactly the kind of book she would have found interesting. "How did you know I'd like this?" she asked, standing at the fence in February, her breath visible, her coat buttoned to the throat. "You asked me about the soil composition," he said. "Chapter 4. She opened it to Chapter 4. He was right. "You've read it 3 times, she said, looking at the worn spine. "About that. And you're giving it to me." "I know what's in it," he said. "You don't yet." Willa looked at him over the fence, 53 years old and standing in the cold like he'd been there all along and expected to remain. "Everett," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt the small weight of it as she said it. "I am going to ask you something directly." "All right," he said. "Are we courting?" He was quiet. Not the quiet of a man caught off guard, but the quiet of a man who is being careful with something he doesn't want to drop. "I've been trying to figure out," he said finally, "how to ask you the same thing." "You could have just asked," she said. "I could," he said. "I wasn't sure of the answer." "What answer?" "Yours," he said. "I'm 53 years old, Miss Oakes. Willa, you're 24. That's not nothing." "I told you in November," she said. "It isn't a problem for me." "You said that," he agreed. "Do you require me to say it again?" A pause. Something moved in his face, the same thing that had almost been a smile in November, and this time it completed itself. "No," he said. "Once is enough." They were married in April of 1888 at the Greeley Crossing Church, which held 40 people comfortably and 60 with goodwill, and had 63 in attendance because Harlan County turned out in full for a wedding and had opinions about seating arrangements that were not Willa's to manage. Everett Colm was 54 years old and looked, on his wedding day, like a man who has lived a long time and arrived at the right place. Willa Oakes. Willa Colm, as of noon on a Tuesday in April, was 25, and wore a dress that Josephine Marsh had sent from Lincoln on 6 days' notice and which fit almost perfectly, and stood at the front of the church next to a man who was 29 years her senior and felt, to her, like the most sensible thing she had ever done. Mrs. Halverson, who had organized the county's ages and knew everyone's business, wept openly and said afterward that she had seen it coming from the first note on the fence post and considered herself personally responsible. Nobody disagreed with her. It was easier that way. They farmed together for 31 years. The school grew. Willa taught through 3 different schoolhouses. The one beside the orchard, a larger one built in 1892, and a proper brick building in 1901 that had a wood stove and enough desks for all the children and a window in the east wall that she had specifically requested because she liked the morning light. She taught until she was 56 years old, long enough to have taught the children of her first students, which she considered one of the more remarkable things that had ever happened to her. Everett expanded the orchard. He added pear trees in 1890, cherries in 1895, and a small plum grove in 1903, which never quite thrived, but which he tended with the patient attention of a man who knows the difference between failure and not yet. He was 82 years old the winter the snow came early and heavy. Willa was 53. She sat with him through the cold months, which she had become good at, having spent a career managing rooms full of people who did not always want to be managed. She read to him The History of Nebraska Settlement, again, Chapter 4, his favorite, though by then she knew it better than he did, and sometimes they argued about which passage came next. He was usually right. She didn't tell him that. The last thing he said to her that made her laugh was about the plum grove. Should have planted those 10 years earlier, he said, in March, his voice quieter than it used to be, but still certain in the way it had always been certain. Soil wasn't ready. The soil was perfectly ready, Willa said. You weren't ready. He looked at her for a moment. 82 years old, and still that face, broad and weathered and certain of itself. You might be right, he said. I usually am, she said. I know, he said. It's one of the things I like best about you. Willa Colm, 53 years old, the same age he'd been when she found his ladder against her wall, held his hand in the cold, bright morning, and thought about 29 years, and what they add up to, and whether there is a word for the particular fullness of a life built one fence post at a time, one note folded and left in the cold, one cup of coffee handed to a man on a ladder who hadn't expected it. She didn't think there was a word. She thought that was all right. Some things are too particular to need one. He passed in April, in the same month they had married, which she thought he would have found apt and slightly too neat, and would have said so, and she would have agreed, and they would have argued about it pleasantly for 20 minutes. She lived to be 87. She kept teaching until she couldn't, and after that she kept the school in other ways. Books sent, former students visited, letters written in a hand that got smaller but never stopped being precise. She kept the orchard, too, or her nephew did, which is nearly the same thing. The plum grove finally took in the end. She wrote to her nephew that Everett had been right about the soil, but wrong about the timing, and that she considered this a fair summary of his character, and that she meant it as the highest compliment she knew. She kept the notes, all of them, every folded piece of paper from that first September to the last winter, in a wooden box that had come from Ohio in 1866 and smelled of cedar and cold weather. When her grandniece found the box after she was gone, there were 47 notes. Some of them were about apples. Some of them were about the fence and the creek and the plank bridge. And some of them, the ones near the end of the first year, the ones worn soft at the fold from being opened and refolded, were not about anything practical at all. The last note in the box, in Everett Colm's careful hand, said only this: "The plank is still good. Come across whenever you like." E.C. Willa had written underneath it, in her own smaller hand, a single word: always. You know, I've been telling stories for a long time now. Long enough to know that the ones that stay with you aren't usually the ones about grand gestures. They're the ones about a ladder leaning against a wall, a note on a fence post, A plank bridge with a rope handhold set at exactly the right height. The ones where love shows up looking like practicality until you get close enough to see what it really is. If this story found you today, wherever you are, I'm glad. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. And if you have someone in your life who fixes things before you know they need fixing, someone who notices without being asked, maybe this story is for them too. Thank you for riding along with Prairie Hearts. May God bless you and yours. Keep riding, friends. We'll see you on the trail.